Welcome to the Human Longevity Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Melissa Petersen. Together, we're about to explore the science and solutions that will help you live better, longer. In today's episode, we are joined by international breathing expert, McKeown. He is the author of the best-selling book, The Oxygen Advantage, and he is doing so much around the globe to truly help people to understand how to breathe better. So get ready to learn why breath really matters, how it actually can help to slow down the rate and pace of biological aging, how many breaths you should breathe per minute. Should you breathe in your nose or your mouth? What's the right way, and how can you optimize your breathing, optimize your health and your longevity starting today? This and so much more is covered in today's conversation. So listen, in order to get all of the goodies that we're going to talk about here inside of this episode, be sure to go over to humanlongevity.com/podcast. There you're going to hear from all of our sponsors, and you're going to be able to access the free resources. Now, I specifically have a free breath course just for you, just for listening. If you want to go deeper into the science of breath, go over to humanlongevity.com/podcast. And again, there you'll find all of our free resources and a little bit of goodies and surprises from our sponsors. So now let's get into today's episode.
It is really a true honor to have you here, because I think that we often forget just how important breath is. And you're going to connect us to a fundamental aspect that will allow us to not only look better and feel better, but have the ability to even live longer while thriving. So welcome to the summit.
Thanks very much, Dr. Petersen. And yeah, it's great to have the opportunity to talk about breath. I think traditionally it was always seen on the fringes, people didn't pay too much attention, but now it's getting in there. So it's good.
It was interesting years ago, probably 6-7 years ago now, I happened to go to this event that Oprah Winfrey had here in the US. She kind of did a tour around all these major cities. And so she had all these big speakers come in. And there was this one speaker, an author, his name is Rob Bell. And he starts his talk with the moment that his child was born. And he's taking us in and how the child comes out, and the doctors are, making sure that the child starts to breathe. And then he goes to the next story and talks about his grandmother, who was his everything, and being there with her at her last breath. Mm-hmm. And it was a goosebump moment because, he's like, breath, like his whole conversation was really more through a consciousness and spiritual and metaphorical lens. And yet the reality, it's kind of like, yes, of course. It is the one theme that permeates our entire physical existence of life. And yet, why aren't we talking about it more? Why don't we think and look at the true, the power that's within it? Because until I learned about your work, even as a clinician, and I taught yoga for years, and I was always in fitness. I started dancing when I was 2.5 years old. And I did a lot of breath work, but a lot of pranayama breath work is in the nose, out through the mouth. And that's how I would teach people for years. And it wasn't until I started to learn about your work that I found out I was doing it all wrong. So help not only me, but help all of us watching today, whether we are a clinician, whether we're an enthusiast, kind of first wrap our head around why breath matters and what we need to know personally and professionally to start to enhance health.
Sure. I think we need to explore. I like the word power, and I often think that the breath it's overlooked in many instances. We need to look at breathing from a slightly different, more detailed dimension. And that's looking at the breath from not only just a biomechanical point of view, which with the emphasis on the greater amplitude of the diaphragm, but also on a biochemical point of view, and also on cadence or coherent point of view. So, for example, we have to consider the first thing is always the foundation of good breathing is in and out through our nose. Our ancestors did it. The animal world, with the exception of a couple of animals, will always breathe in and out. So the innate and the normal physiological mode of the breathing in the human being it's nasal regardless of age. And if we look at the anatomy of the nose, so say, for example, if we look at the anatomy here, so we have a frontal profile here of the nose, and here we have the mouth here, and here we have the nasal cavity. And I suppose the first thing to do is to look just how far back the nasal cavity actually extends into the skull. And I always ask my students, put their tongue into the roof of the mouth and draw your tongue just along the roof of the mouth until you feel the soft palate. And you realize then that the roof of the mouth is the floor of the nose. Now, if we go one step further here and we ask the question, if I breathe in through my mouth, what has the mouth done in terms of the air that has come into the body? And the answer is nothing. So the mouth performs zero functions in terms of breathing. If we breathe in through the mouth, the air goes straight down our throat. And if we breathe in through the nose is the only organ in the human body that serves a purpose of filtering and conditioning that air to the ideal environment for gas exchange to take place in the lungs. And the other thing I would say about mouth breathing is that I was a mouth breather for 20 years. And as a kid, having asthma and, progressive, it kept on getting worse. And with that, I was also having sleep disorders, which is very common amongst people with asthma, because invariably we have breathing pattern disorders. And as a result of having chronic mouth breathing, I was also more stressed, highly strung. And if we think about the connection of the mouth and the upper chest and mouth breathing, how it increases the speed of our breathing, we also know that fast breathing and upper chest breathing agitates the mind. So I always say again to my students, look down at your chest and take a breath in through the mouth. And when you breathe through your mouth, what part of the body moves? And typically mouth breathing is activating the upper chest. Now, we know because of gravity that the greatest concentration of blood is in the lower regions of the lungs. So even if we go for a run with the mouth open, we are ventilating typically the upper regions of the lungs, and the greatest concentration of blood is in the lower regions. So it actually makes more sense, even during physical exercise, to breathe in through the nose, to harness the gas nitric oxide. Nitric oxide is a gas that's produced inside the paranasal sinuses and nasal cavity. We carry that gas with the breath into the lungs. Nitric oxide is a bronchodilator. It helps to open up the airways. It also sterilizes the incoming air, and it also redistributes the blood throughout the lungs so that the pressure of oxygen in the blood is 10% higher with nasal breathing than with mouth breathing. So the nose is connected with greater amplitude of the diaphragm, and the diaphragm breathing muscle located at the base of the ribs is not just for respiration, but it's also for a connection to the emotions. So an Italian osteopath, I think his name is Bordoni, and looking at the connection between the diaphragm and the feedback from the diaphragm back to the brain. And we also know that the diaphragm is innervated by the vagus nerve, and that the communication from the vagus nerve, 80% of it is from the body back to the brain, so that the brain then can send messages throughout the body. So that's just one aspect of it. And then we look at the diaphragm breathing muscle in terms of function, in terms of movement. So with functional breathing, where the diaphragm is moving downwards during the inhalation and moving back upwards to its resting position during exhalation, that it's the pressure generated by the movement of the diaphragm which generates what's called intra-abdominal pressure. And intra-abdominal pressure is necessary for stabilization and support of the spine. So whether we are doing physical exercise, whether we are doing movement, or whether we are just sitting, it's very important that we are engaging the diaphragm. And the main way to engage the diaphragm is to breathe in and out through the nose. And for example, people with lower back pain typically have faulty breathing patterns. And it may be that, is it the lower back pain which is causing faulty breathing? Or is it the faulty breathing which is feeding back into lower back pain? The same with asthma. Is it the feeling of air hunger? Because the person with asthma is feeling that their airways are narrow. They feel that they are not getting enough air. The feeling that they are not getting enough air, they don't continue nasal breathing. They switch to mouth breathing. But this causes further cool, dry air to come into the lungs. Moisture is sucked out of the airways. And as a result, it contributes to bronchoconstriction. And I think there's many, many times that the condition itself is feeding in itself. We see it with people with anxiety and high stress levels. It's normal when the human being gets into stress. We typically breathe faster, harder. We can hold our breath. We have irregular breathing. But the faster and harder breathing and holding of the breath is feeding back into anxiety. And we know from the literature that 80% of the anxiety population have dysfunctional breathing patterns. And I think we have to go a little bit further in that when we talk about breathing, it's not just about taking the deep breath. And
Right.
that's where we should be, delving more into.
Yeah, and that's exactly, I'm glad you said that, because it is, we need to delve into how we're taking these breaths and the rate at which we're breathing. So there's several aspects, right, to when we think about breath. So, okay, it's simple. Yes, we need to breathe. Thank goodness our body does it automatically and we don't have to think about it. Yet right now, everybody listening is thinking about it. They're beginning to notice. And you mentioned, already when we're mouth breathing, we're going to be using, more of that upper 1/3, the lungs and the chest. Well, that also begins to happen just even how we're seated, right? So a lot of our sedentary activity, when we begin to kind of have that forward anterior head carriage, the rounding, the text neck, the digital, kind of desk, if you will, that's also compressing the ability for those lungs to move properly. And so I know there's a number, and I know you're going to know this better than I, certain rates per minute of breathing, just in and out. So whether you're in and out through your nose, in and out through your mouth, or a combination of nose and mouth. First and foremost, the breath cycle matters because that has been also tied to anxiety and stress and high blood pressure. And so let's just start there for a moment because I don't want to misquote the numbers. Do you know what those ranges are, kind of on the breaths per minute?
Sure. Typically, 20 years ago, it was regarded that normal respiratory rate for an adult is about 12 to 14 breaths per minute. Now we are seeing a change in that now what's regarded as normal is 14 to 16 breaths per minute. So what is regarded as normal is increasing, which is not a good sign. And I don't think it's a good sign because 16 breaths per minute is too fast. Now,
I believe is research, and I did not mean to interrupt you, I'm so sorry, that faster breath rate, there are correlations directly with anxiety. And I'm wondering is probably also the rate, and then what I know you're going to take us into is if part of that is out through the mouth, right? Like if in or out through the mouth because there's the exchange of the CO2 and the O2 mechanism. So we've got breath rate. So take us a little deeper into this. So kind of the aspects that we need to become aware of as an individual. So how fast I'm breathing. And you keep hearing Patrick say mouth breathing. And just to be very, very clear, it's a really interesting thing how seldom we realize that we are breathing in or out through our mouth. And so I just want to invite everybody watching just to get curious. It's not, don't try to control your breath. Just as you're listening to this interview, just kind of be an observer of self and notice, are you breathing softly, gently, continuously, just in and out through the nose? And or are you in through the nose, out through the mouth? Or in and out through the mouth? So just kind of get curious and notice first and foremost, what is that combination? And obviously what we keep hearing is the most ideal is in and out through the nose. So Patrick, help us to continue to understand why, and, because sometimes we can't help it, right? Like we don't realize we're doing it. I know I'm out for a walk with my husband. We're going up a hill and I find myself sometimes I'm like, close my mouth. And I'll see him. I'm like, close your mouth. I do this all the time, close your mouth. But it just kind of happens. So why does it just happen? And again, how do we start? And why does it matter if it does?
Yeah, why do we switch to persistent mouth breathing? And we know with the childhood population, it's between 25 and 50% of studied children. And the reason that we will switch to mouth breathing is because of a number of factors. One is 60% of the Western population have a deviated septum. I have a deviated septum. The bone and the cartilage dividing one side of my nose to the other is crooked. And this can impair nasal breathing. However, the vast majority of people can still breathe through their nose with a deviated septum. But when people feel air hunger, they typically switch to mouth breathing. And air hunger could be there's a mechanical obstruction such as a deviated septum. They may have allergic rhinitis. They may have inflammation of the nose. They may just anatomically have a more narrower nose or nasal entry. So a child or an adult will typically switch to mouth breathing as a result of air hunger. Now, mouth breathing, there's very little resistance to breathing through the mouth during wakefulness. The nose imposes a resistance to breathing during wakefulness that's 2 to 3 times that of the mouth. And this is good because nose breathing, by virtue of slowing down the breath, is allowing sufficient time for oxygen to transfer into the lungs. By slowing down breathing, we breathe less breaths per minute, so we are not wasting so much air in dead space. By slowing down breathing, it gives sufficient time for oxygen to transfer from the lungs into the blood, but also from slowing down breathing, it's very important for the mind. Now, I know it has often been conducted in terms of, say, counseling, and this also is discussed in the literature, that you could have a client coming into you, and that client is breathing 20 breaths per minute. And you say to the client, well, now what I would like you to do is start changing your breathing pattern, that you are not breathing 20 breaths per minute. Let's slow it down to 10 breaths per minute. So the therapist in this example is encouraging the client to reduce the respiratory rate. But in the process, the tidal volume or the size of each breath increases disproportionately, so that minute ventilation is increased. So the client is coming in with chronic hyperventilation syndrome or breathing pattern disorders, but they are leaving with even worse chronic hyperventilation syndrome or breathing pattern disorders. And here's the thing about the breath. The rate is important, but we need to also consider tidal volume. We need to consider minute ventilation. Now, they go hand in hand, because when we breathe through the nose and we engage the diaphragm with greater amplitude of the diaphragm, that in turn is increasing tidal volume. And also it's slowing down the respiratory rate. So diaphragmatic breathers tend to be slower breathers than upper chest breathers. And the other aspect of it is the number of people who, as a result of, say, a mental illness or as a result of a physical condition, they typically have reduced heart rate variability. And heart rate variability is regarded as, it's a clinical measure of stress or a measure of vagal tone, or to give you some indicator of the functioning of the autonomic nervous system. So, for example, if a client goes to their doctor and the patient says to the doctor, I feel stressed, the doctor doesn't really have a way of measuring how stress or what is the impact of stress on this person. But using heart rate variability biofeedback, you would have a measure. And the key here is that heart rate variability is a measurement. But how do you improve heart rate variability? That's slow breathing. Now, here is where it gets a little bit muddied. In my field, working with breathing for 15 years, I focused primarily on the biochemistry. And this was focused on getting people to deliberately underbreathe, to create a little bit of air hunger, to reduce the chemosensitivity of the body to carbon dioxide, to normalize minute ventilation. So I was focusing primarily on biochemistry. With yoga, the instructor is generally focusing on the biomechanics. They're focusing on lateral expansion and contraction, on engaging the diaphragm. But they are not looking at the biochemistry, and they are not looking at the cadence of breathing. Heart rate variability biofeedback is looking at cadence breathing, but they are not necessarily looking at the biomechanics, and they are not looking at biochemistry. So all of us have been in our own little worlds, and it's only in the last 3 to 4 years that I've started to step out, and this is really when it's amazing. Mm-hmm. And then now when I'm working with my students for the last few years, I want to improve the biochemistry. I want to improve the biomechanics, but we also spend time practicing cadence breathing, because I don't want to focus on one dimension of breathing and in the process sacrifice the other dimensions. And it's not that breathing is complicated. I think an acronym that people will remember is LSD. Maybe those teenagers that were a bit wily during the 1990s. So L is standing for light, S is standing for slow, and D is standing for deep. And that way we should be considering breathing. So breathing should never be heard during rest. It should always be subtle.
I love this. So light, slow, deep.
Yes.
And you brought up a couple of really so many important points, and I just want to take a moment to kind of bring these together. So, one of the conversations that we're exploring throughout the summit is definitely the biochemistry, right? What are the biochemical, physiological impacts on our system that are contributing to the acceleration of cellular aging? And so the biochemistry part of this is important. And I want to explore that for a moment in context of just this conversation around, aging at a cellular level. I love that you have understood the importance, because we're also talking about, again, even through the lens of longevity, and there's these different here's the different lanes, right? The scientists are just looking at the biochemistry. The clinicians in the integrated space and biohackers are, looking more through the lifestyle. Then there's kind of this spiritual side, consciousness, yet not everybody is saying, wait a minute, there's what's happening in the body and what's affecting that. What's affecting this biochemistry? Well, okay, yes, lifestyle, habits, thoughts, beliefs, interactions, outer world is signaling and contributing to the effects, how the body's responding in that inner world. Yet there's more than just these habits. What else? What are these unseen components? Because especially in the conversation of lifespan, people who seem to have broken the mold, right? They're not following traditional eat this way, sleep this way, move this way. They're the rebels. They're doing it all their own way. And they're living these really, they're living a lot longer than their counterparts who are supposedly doing it the right way. And so it's kind of going, okay, when we can pull all of these different ingredients together and realize that we as an individual are part of this, we're a complex being and we're informed and we interact, with the entirety of the world around us and how we love our existence within it. So kind of the outlier is the purpose, the meaning, the joy, right? That's kind of that magic secret sauce. So, but grounding it into the biochemistry for a moment. At a cellular level, one of the big contributors to acceleration of aging is oxidative stress. And of course, oxygen plays a role within that. So maybe you could take a minute and take us into kind of where, again, we think oxygen is good, yet we're also hearing about CO2. So just break this down in a real simple way that we can understand the importance of the dynamic between right amount of oxygen and when is it not right that all of a sudden we're going into oxidative stress within the system, and what's the role that CO2 plays that we need to figure out how to leverage our breath for a more harmonious, what do I want to say? Just experience with it in our health.
Sure. If we look at any medical textbook that has a section of respiration, there's a curve in it called the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. And the curve plots on the vertical axis, it plots the saturation of the arterial blood with oxygen. So hemoglobin, which is the main carrier of oxygen in the blood, the fraction of hemoglobin occupied by oxygen. And the horizontal axis plots the concentration of oxygen in the blood, the pressure, PO2. And then we have a sigmoid shaped curve, and that's normal body temperature, normal carbon dioxide. But the Bohr effect, discovered back by a Danish physiologist back in 1904, he basically said that carbon dioxide pressure in the blood, as carbon dioxide increases, blood pH drops, and this is a catalyst for hemoglobin to release oxygen. So hemoglobin is releasing oxygen from the blood to the tissues in the presence of carbon dioxide. Now, the whole oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve considers and takes into consideration the Bohr effect, that if you hyperventilate, if you breathe hard, you're blowing off too much carbon dioxide from the blood through the lungs, and that's causing a left shift of the curve, and the bond between oxygen and hemoglobin is strengthened, or the bond between hemoglobin and oxygen is strengthened. And conversely, if you breathe light, or if you do physical exercise with your mouth closed, that will allow carbon dioxide to increase in the blood. And carbon dioxide is increasing when you feel air hunger, because the primary stimulus to breathe is not oxygen. Unless oxygen drops to about 50%. So typically the primary stimulus to breathe is carbon dioxide. So if you go for a run with your mouth closed, the air hunger that you experience during the run is higher because of the resistance to your breathing in and out through the nose. But the air hunger signifies that carbon dioxide is increased in the blood. And as carbon dioxide is increasing, hemoglobin is releasing oxygen more readily to the working muscles. So as a result, then, the fraction of expired oxygen is less when people nasal breathe during physical exercise. So I think we have to bear in mind, like, it's very common for people who are hard breathing, a little bit faster, a little bit upper chest, to have cold hands and cold feet. That the blood vessels are constricting in response to the constriction of smooth muscle because of the drop to blood carbon dioxide. And carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is 0.03% of the atmospheric pressure. It's not very much. Carbon dioxide in the lungs is 5%. So the human body produces carbon dioxide as a result of our metabolism, but we must have a normal minute ventilation to ensure that we have normal carbon dioxide in the blood. And it's the amount of air that we breathe, the volume of air, that determines the carbon dioxide in the lungs. And it's the CO2 in the lungs, which determines the CO2 in the blood. And if we are breathing too hard, not only is it's contributing to, for example, it's affecting the central nervous system, it's also reducing oxygen delivery to tissues. It's causing blood vessels to constrict. So there's many aspects in terms of, the other aspect of it is increased pain and reduced pain thresholds. And we also need to bear in mind, and I as a man have overlooked this for 15 years until I started looking at it very, very recently. Women have very much different breathing than men. So women, younger women, especially during the monthly cycle, and we're talking about post-ovulation, days 10 to days 22, there's a spike or an increase of progesterone, which is a respiratory stimulant. And this in turn can cause carbon dioxide levels in the blood drop by up to 25%. And as a result, this will contribute to symptoms such as increased pain, fatigue, anxiety, exhaustion, and symptoms related to that. Now, here is the key. How about a female that doesn't have good breathing anyway, and then goes through day 10 to day 22? And we've seen it, and this has been researched since 1905, but unfortunately, breathing instructors, we have overlooked it. We have overlooked the fact that 50% of my students coming in, being female, I overlooked the fact of the hormonal changes on the female. And the other thing I overlooked was then postmenopause, when sleep disorder breathing in females increases by 200% of an increase. And again, we can impact and influence that. So whether male or female, I think it's really, really important. And when we're talking about stress in the body, we know that stress makes people sick. And we know that stress, it has a huge influence on our breathing pattern. And chronic stress, we are not able to cope with chronic stress. The human being throughout our evolution, we never had to cope with long-term chronic stress, the same stress that we are experiencing today. However, one way of helping to counter the effects of stress is slowing down our breathing patterns, but also good quality of sleep. And if you look at the statistics on people with sleep disorder breathing, insomnia, obstructive sleep apnea, and the impact that that's having on longevity. And sleep is often being overlooked. And, I spoke many conferences in terms of sleep. And there was one doctor from Stanford. He was a French doctor. His name was Dr. Christian Guilleminault, Guilleminault. And he coined the phrase obstructive sleep apnea back in the 1970s. And he also developed the apnea-hypopnea index, which is a measurement of the severity of the condition. But for the last 5 years, he's been speaking about the critical importance of restoring nasal breathing during sleep. But this all ties in, Melissa, because there's a huge connection. If you think of, if we are anxious, and this is any person, if I have a bad day and my thoughts, and generally I'm pretty good in terms of, because I'm connected with the breath. But when our thoughts are quite fast and the mind is racing, we don't sleep well that night. We have a light sleep. We're twisting and turning for many hours of the night. We wake up feeling exhausted. So anxiety is impacting our sleep. When we wake up feeling exhausted, we're more prone to anxiety. And breathing then, anxiety is impacting our breathing. We breathe harder and faster. Hard and fast breathing is impacting our anxiety, and hard and fast breathing is impacting our sleep. Now, when doctors look at sleep, they traditionally look at the airway only, but we need to consider the pipe from the point of view of an engineer. If an engineer is looking at a pipe, that engineer is not just going to consider the diameter of the pipe, but is also going to consider flow. Now, I'm going to do a small experiment in terms of snoring. There's two types of snoring. Mouth snoring goes like this. Nose snoring goes like this. So its both is caused by turbulence, and both is caused by increased flow through a narrow space. Now, if we breathe it really slowly, and if we slow down the speed of the breath coming into the nose, and we have a very relaxed and slow, gentle breath out, and with slow breathing, now we try to snore. And you will see it's more difficult, because snoring is not just due to the anatomy of the airway, but slow snoring is also contributed to by the respiratory rate and depth of breathing. Not just snoring, but also obstructive sleep apnea. And it's how we breathe during wakefulness that determines how we breathe during exercise and during sleep. And this is coming back to longevity. You know, if we're talking about the stress on the body, we have to consider sleep. And I woke up for years, I woke up feeling absolutely exhausted. Mm-hmm. And I, as a youngster going into school, falling asleep on a school desk in my high school years, I was a chronic mouth breather, chronic asthmatic, and unfortunately, nobody ever told me, Patrick, breathe through my nose. And I switched to nasal breathing after reading a newspaper article. And that night I taped my mouth closed, which seems a bit bizarre, but I tried it. And I also wore Breathe Light, the Breathe Right, or the nasal dilator. And the first morning I woke up feeling, I was kind of getting used to it. The second morning, I repeated the same thing the second night. I had my mouth taped and I wore nasal dilator. And I woke up the second morning with best night's sleep I could remember in many, many years. And that is the impact of nasal breathing during sleep. Now we know more recent studies that the airway, how it impacts SIDS in children. And I can show you a couple of papers, how it's impacting the severity of obstructive sleep apnea and how it's impacting the cognitive development of children. So I would love to see breathing getting much more attention in terms of the research. And it's not just about nasal breathing, it's not just about getting the mouth closed, but it's about improving the biochemistry and the biomechanics of the breath. Mm-hmm. The first paper that I would like to share with you is, I'm not sure now what screen, because I have two screens. Do you see a paper called DECT, Nasomaxillary Complex in Young Children?
Yes.
Now, this paper here was published in the European Journal of Pediatrics in 2012. The co-author here is Dr. Christian Guilleminault, Stanford-based medical doctor. You see that he's got 1,011 publications and 54,000 citations. Now, this is an awful paper. And I mean, it's an awful paper in terms of any parent who was reading this. They looked at 7 infants who died as a result of sudden infant death syndrome. And all of the autopsy demonstrated variable enlargement of the upper airway soft tissues in all cases. In all cases, there were features consistent with a narrow, small nasomaxillary complex. And all children died of hypoxia during sleep. And anatomic risk factors for narrow airway can be determined early in life, and these traits are often genetic. Now, the first thing that I'd say here is, I have characteristics of poor genetics as a result probably of mouth breathing during childhood. But my daughter was born with a high narrow palate, so definitely it's passed on. And it probably is due to the environment and the food that we are eating and lack of breastfeeding and eating food that is chewed, pre-chewed food. Mm. But here is the thing. Anybody looking into the roof of a child's mouth should be able to determine, well, I'm talking about a healthcare professional looking into a child's mouth, determining how high is the palate. And could simple strategies of even the mother, showing the mother, putting the two thumbs into the roof of the child's mouth and exerting with gloves on a gentle pressure just to expand the palate, to make room for the nose. And you see my anatomy here. And so there is a genetic thing, there is an environmental thing here, but this could be avoided, sudden infant death syndrome, and that is related to airway. Now, the second paper that I would like to show you was a study conducted in the United Kingdom in a town called Stratford-upon-Avon, which, if my history serves me well, is the town that Shakespeare hailed from. So this was published in the journal Pediatrics, and it was published in 2012. And the lead author here is Karen Bonnock. Now, she looked at 11,000 children, and she looked at a history of sleep disorder breathing through 5 years of age. So those kids who had sleep disorder breathing, by the way, sleep disorder breathing, just snoring is sleep disorder breathing. You don't have to have the child stopping breathing or anything like that. Okay. But a history of sleep disorder breathing through 5 years of age was associated with a near 40% increased risk of special education needs at 8 years of age.
Wow.
And this was among 11,000 children. Now, the statistics in the United States, again, if I can remember, 1 in 10 children are currently affected by ADD, ADHD, autism, poor developmental problems, special education needs. We need to be looking at these kids' sleep, and we need to be looking at these kids' anatomy. Now, the third paper that I'm going to show you points to adults. And the reason that I think it's very, very important is because we know that 50% of the adult population over 40 years of age, sorry, I'm going to repeat that.
Okay.
Individuals over 40 years of age, they are six times more likely to spend at least 50% of their sleep time utilizing oronasal breathing. And now we investigate, I'm just going to look at this paper published only a few months ago, the association between the breathing route, oxygen desaturation, and upper airway morphology. And the conclusion here was that mouth breathing was significantly associated with worse oxygen desaturation and increased degree of upper airway collapse. Now, I'm just going to move down to the stats itself, because the stats are shocking. Here we have individuals, of 95 individuals who were monitored over, I think it was about 12 months or so. The average age, mouth breathing, 11.6% were mouth breathers of that population, of the 95 individuals. The individuals who were mouth breathing, their AHI was 52 events per hour, which is severe, very severe. And their minimal oxygen, blood oxygen saturation went down to 64%. This is really extreme stress on the body. Now, if we look at the group who are oronasal breathing, 51%, and this is more common, that we don't have the mouth open 100% of the time, but we typically switch between nose and mouth breathing and vice versa, or utilizing both nose and mouth. Mm-hmm. The AHI in this instance was 42 events per hour. So once it's over 30, it's severe. And the blood oxygen saturation, the SaO2 dropped down to 77%, which is also severe. Mm-hmm. Now, if we look at the incidence of mouth breathing or oronasal breathing in this population of 95 people, we see that 60 people out of 95 people are utilizing mouth and oronasal breathing. Now, of that, 35 individuals are nasal breathing only. So 35 individuals. The average age here is 45 years of age, 51 years of age, and 48 years of age. And the AHI, when the individuals were breathing only through the nose, was 27 events per hour. Now, it's still heading for severe. However, it's a lot less severe than oronasal breathing or than mouth breathing. Now, the blood oxygen saturation here did drop to severe levels, 78%. But this is only looking at the comparison between nose and mouth breathing. Again, we know that the phenotypes of sleep apnea, high loop gain, affecting 30% of the population, means that you have a strong chemosensitivity to carbon dioxide buildup, and others, upper airway recruitment, arousal threshold. All of the phenotypes of sleep apnea can be impacted by changing breathing patterns. Now, this field is crying out for research, but we're joining the dots. And I just wrote a book of 140,000 words, and I put a lot of emphasis on sleep, and especially with children, because 25 to 50% of studied children are persistently mouth-breathing. And it's not that just that these children are tired, but their cognitive development is affected. And I remember back in 2016, Christian Guilleminault has since passed on, unfortunately, because he was a great driving force in improving awareness of nasal breathing during sleep. And I remember him standing at a conference, and he said to the doctors, he said, we are missing the elephant in the room here. When it comes to sleep, nasal breathing is absolutely paramount. Well, I'm paraphrasing him, I don't know his exact words, but he talked about the importance of nasal breathing. And he also said, this I do remember, and I quote, he said that children's brains are getting fried. And their brains are getting fried because of the poor sleep and oxygen desaturation happening. And, you know, this is something that I have been on a quest, because I was that kid, and academic achievement, you know, my academic scores were based on what I achieve academically. Nobody considered my sleep. How can a child who is tired score well academically? How can a child, you know, I was spending 12 hours a day studying to get my grades, but not every kid does that. And that's why I would love to see a fundamental change and awareness of breathing.
And so because I know we've got a few minutes left with you, and this has been absolutely fantastic. I want to put some context that, you know, so if we've got children, you know, ours, family members, it becomes important to, you know, or that we're caring for as clinicians, to be mindful of how they're breathing, right? Critical time.
Yes.
And so is step one for mouth breathing. Of course, there's the conscious awareness of just close your mouth, right? So just beginning with that so that the child can have an awareness. And this starts in childhood, but it's obviously something that goes throughout life. So many of us are, you know, at different stages in our life that we have habits. We don't even realize when that we might be mouth breathing, or for over 40, there's an increased chance that maybe we're doing a little bit of nose and mouth breathing at night. Mm-hmm. So, and a point I also want to bring up, because obviously we can go, okay, wait, so I can see it during the day. I can see it in somebody else. I can become aware of it for myself. I don't really know yet about sleep, but let's just make an assumption I am. You know, maybe my partner, my spouse is telling me, yes, you're snoring, so I know that I am. So we're going to look at those areas. There's another piece that I don't think often the dots get connected on, and I would not have known this had I not personally gone through it. When I started to really pay attention to my breath, I do a lot of this every day. I talk a lot. Yeah. And I'm sure many of us do, you know, but especially, and I had my nutrition dialed in, my sleep was dialed in. Every day I would end the day just like, and loving what I do, right? Like awesome day, but tanked, absolutely tanked. And I didn't realize how much CO2 I was constantly dumping. I was disrupting that balance. And so when I intentionally began, I like your LSD, right? So just light, slow, deep. When I became really mindful of any opportunity, first to slow down my talking, right? Just even through my day, like slow down my pace. And when somebody else is talking, keep my mouth shut and really focus on my breath. Mm-hmm. It had to become a very intentional process for me, and it shifted everything. You know, and I'm sure you hear this from the students you work with, from the coaches that you certify, and the clients that they're working with. And so I'm glad I got to go through that myself, to be able to be an advocate of breath. And it's not just the obvious of where we can see somebody opening their mouth. We forget that we're opening our mouths every day, talking and communicating. And so being more conscious in that process, light, slow, deep, slow it down, close it up, right? Listen more, speak slower. becomes throughout the day. So now help us to know in our last few minutes how we start to retrain a different response. How do we start to really get good at just breathing in and out of your nose?
If your nose is stuffy, you can decongest your nose holding your breath. And this has been known since 1923. It's not exactly known how it works. It may be because of an increase of carbon dioxide in the blood. It may be pooling of nitric oxide. It could be activation of the sympathetic response. And don't do this exercise if you're pregnant or if you have any serious medical conditions. And the exercise goes as follows. If your nose is stuffy, and even if you have a head cold and you want to open up your nose, take a normal breath in and out through your nose, just normal. Normal breath in and out through your nose, pinch your nose and hold. And you could just gently nod your head up and down, holding your breath. And keep holding your breath, and keep holding your breath, and keep nodding your head just gently up and down, and keep going until the air hunger gets relatively strong. You have to hold the breath for an adult for about 30 seconds, and then let go and breathe in through the nose. And then you wait about a minute and you do it again. And if you do that 5 or 6 times, the nose starts to open up. So that's one aspect of it. The second aspect is for children. We put all of the children's videos free. Every exercise for kids are free. Showing them how to open up the nose, the importance of nasal breathing, how to look intelligent, protecting dental health. Children, for example, we've more likely to have bad breath and dental cavities, etc. So they're all up on YouTube, all the free videos for kids. For sleep, for adults, we use a tape called Myo tape. And for children during the day, I used to get a little bit frustrated with kids, as you do, kids are kids, and I'd go through all of the exercise with them. And I knew the kids, because when I have the kids at my own little clinic, I actually have them tape up with the parents. And I have the children running and doing press-ups and doing all of these physical movements with their mouth closed. Number one is I want to determine, is the obstruction of the nose the adenoids, so that they wouldn't be able to physically breathe through the nose. So I kind of go through a process to determine, why does this child have the mouth open? Is it because of an obstruction, or is it because of a behavior? And if it's because of an obstruction, where is the obstruction? If it's the front of the nose, we can help open it up doing the exercise. Because the one thing about the nose is the more we use it, the better it works. So I would go through all of the exercise with the child, and then the children come back into me a week later and the mouths are hanging open again. I said, oh my God, what's going on here? So we go through everything again. And then same thing happens a week later. Kids can be unaware. So I said, we really need to change the behavior here. And it stems back to when I had a nasal operation back in 1994 for a deviated septum and turbinate reduction. I was never told to breathe through it afterwards. And here is the thing, and we know that with children and with adults are the same, even if we fix the nose. And I was focusing on addressing the obstruction, but I wasn't doing a good job on changing the behavior. So then I started saying to the parents, I says, we need to get your child wearing a tape around their mouth during the day, especially when they are distracted. When they're watching TV, if they're on iPhone, if they're on iPad, if they're playing with toys, I need that for 30 minutes a day, every single day, because that's how we change the behavior. Now, I'd like to demonstrate it to you, because I know what some people are saying, taping of the mouth, and of course it's different. The tape that we use it's Myo tape, and this here is the adults version of it. But the child's, of course, is suited to a child.
And we can use this at night as well, right? This would be for those of us during sleep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's anybody waking up with a dry mouth in the morning. So you see the tape is shaped like this. Mm-hmm. And I'm just going to peel off one of them, and it's elasticated and it's cotton. And I'm stretching it, and that's it. Now it gives me a pout. Now the other thing here is that it could be having some impact on the muscle surrounding the mouth, the orbicularis oris muscle, and in helping to train that. But if a child, for example, if they're watching TV and if they forget to open the mouth, the tape automatically reminds them to get the mouth closed. And the child though can communicate. So before we were using 3M micropore tape during wakefulness, but the child would get frustrated because they couldn't communicate. So it's about changing, I suppose, the habit as well as the obstruction. And I would say to anybody, listen, any adult, sit down in the evening, bring your attention out of the mind onto the breath, and gently slow down and reduce the volume of your breathing, and do it to the point of a little air hunger. And see, does it change the saliva in the mouth? See, does it make you drowsy because it's activating the parasympathetic response? And see, does it change the temperature of your fingers? Because you can influence your blood circulation by changing your breath, but that's only the start of it.
Wow. And there's so much more we could discuss. This has been absolutely enlightening, inspiring, and absolutely informative. Patrick, where can people find out more about you, about your books, your upcoming book, the mouth tape, all of it?
So the website that would be more focused on sleep disorder, breathing, and anxiety in kids, buteicoclinic.com, BUTEYKO clinic.com. Now, it's not just about the Buteyko method. We actually do, it's called functional breathing, because my background is Buteyko, but we look at a lot more in terms of everything that we can do to improve the functional breathing. And then sports performance is oxygenadvantage.com. And then the tape is myotape.com.
Fantastic. And we'll make sure all those links are here with this interview. Patrick, thank you so much. So remember, light, soft, and even slowing it down and breathing deeper, keeping it in and out through the nose, becoming mindful of if you're breathing through the mouth, to soften, close that mouth. If you know you have any disruption during the night, you or your child or your spouse or somebody that you love that you're with, then go ahead and make sure you get that tape. Notice how you respond through your day, because your breath matters. It is the one thing that is with us from the moment we come into this life until the moment that we transcend from it. It is our connection point into all that we are to be able to flourish and thrive and beyond. Patrick, thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Doctor.